So. All right, buddy. It is 5:50 p.m. In the 5th of January. This is our first podcast since you returned from your holiday over the Christmas and I guess up to the crack of the new year.
The crack of the new year, that's right.
You were up with your parents in Trinity.
That's right. And then we all came back, and it's 2021, baby.
Mm-hmm.
We are here.
Ready to go. So one of the things we were talking about doing before is watching this Princeton series on... This Columbia series on the history of the world. Oh, sorry. I already gave the date.
Mm-hmm.
This Columbia series on the history of the world, 3902, I think, is the course code. And it's very... I've seen the first episode where he does sort of the preamble, and we just watched the second episode together. It was an hour and 10 minutes, and I think you put a lot of things in your brain and put a lot of things in my brain.
Right.
It seems like a really good series so far.
Yeah.
The lectures and he's clearly more of a researcher than a professor, as many university professors are.
Right.
But he's saying a lot of very interesting things, and I thought it would be a good idea to get us both on right after that and talk a little bit about historical narrative, because
absolutely,
that's certainly something we both thought a lot about.
For sure. Do you want to start off with maybe some rough thoughts you have?
Sure. So I've been doing I did some reading over the last year on the basis of civilization.
Right.
And one of the big holes is my geological knowledge.
Right.
And then by some remarkable coincidence, my grandmother just sent me this book for Christmas that's all about geology.
Nice.
That I'm excited to read, and I'm a couple chapters in now.
Very nice, yeah.
But there's this... I'm reading this stuff in order to try and get an idea of world history.
Right.
So that's part of the reason that I've been drawn into this world history course.
Right.
Is because I'm interested in how civilizations and how people have evolved throughout the entire history of the world.
Yes.
In part because I think history acts as this kind of basic narrative flow from which all the other things that I'm interested in can be related.
Right.
So, I'm very interested in science, I'm very interested in philosophy, and as I'm doing research into both of those areas, I want to have that sort of almost grounding idea of history itself in order so that I can, so that when there's a mathematical development at a certain point in time, I can also know what's roughly happening contextually, historically speaking.
Right.
Because sometimes when you're learning especially from good interdisciplinary professors, they will let you know what's going on around particular developments in science and mathematics and philosophy in the historical world, and sometimes they won't. So, and sometimes when they do, there are limits in their knowledge, and there are things that they might not be fully aware of.
Absolutely.
That you can, if you have a bit of background yourself, you can compare. So really, one of my things is just trying to know as much as possible about as wide a variety of topics as possible, because I think that's a sort of knowledge that is undervalued in the way our institutions are set up.
Yes.
And I like in general in the world, I think knowledge is undervalued, and that's a different discussion entirely. But history, there's a lot of really interesting chains and pieces of thought in history, and the history in a way is a great unifier.
Right.
No matter what your cultural basis is, everybody in a cultural sense seems to have some idea of what came before them, and they have an interpretation and a narrative. And for some civilizations, that's more of a religious narrative. For some, it's more of a scientific narrative. It depends entirely on sort of where you are and what point of history you're at.
And a personal narrative too, as well. So a lot of people I know like to learn about their ancestors, and that forms the idea of who they are. And that's particularly important for different communities where we are in North America right now, especially a lot of indigenous and Afro-Indigenous communities. There's a big movement right now that's happening relatively recently about looking back at historical narratives between Black and Indigenous peoples of North America in particular, and trying to piece out commonalities and common struggles. So the whole process of kind of looking back into history, finding different narratives to almost pull up from that reservoir and weave into something that affects the present moment, or how we perceive the present moment, is, I think, a shared value of historical study that we are both interested in.
Yes, definitely. There's these modern threads in the interpretation of history, and how the history, especially of sort of racialized history, of
yes.
how these different groups of people interacted, and what that means in terms of how we should act together in the future.
Exactly. And what's really interesting, and I think this sort of professor brought up, is we, in our moment in time, and roughly we can say for both of us personally, because we are almost the same age, we were brought up with a certain story of history, a certain perception of history.
Yes.
And that perception in the time that we've been alive is changing. Mm-hmm. People are looking back and finding evidence that muddies the waters a little bit about that historical narrative that we were brought up as almost like gospel, or if not quite gospel, is pretty near to it.
So I guess that there's, we can dig into that for a moment. I think that there's sort of two parts to that. And one is this sort of singular idea of a narrative, mm-hmm. Which is sort of an overall way of shaping how Western history is done. And then there's this second sort of development that comes along with postmodernism, with theories of literature and all this different stuff. That is a little more recent, and that is reactionary against that sort of narrative.
Yes.
So both of us are really steeped in both of those traditions, and the overlap of that is sort of contradictory. But there is an idea of history from point to point to point that we both kind of share some perception of.
Right.
And there's this idea that the way we do history and the way we look at history sort of intrinsically is in a place of confusion, of a lack of knowledge, of taking these very small points and trying to figure out what happened as a result of a very limited amount of evidence.
Absolutely. I think my mom once said, because she studied this in anthropology, that all the bones that we've based the evidence we have of ancient humanity, it can fit in the back of like a 4x4. Yeah. It's a tiny amount of physical evidence that we have at our disposal, stretching all the way back, of course.
Of course. So there's this duality between the knowledge that we only have a small piece of the puzzle, combined with the knowledge that that small piece of the puzzle is real evidence.
Yes.
And we don't have real evidence outside of that small piece.
Yeah.
So that's the real. That in a way is kind of the real, the two sides of history, and it's kind of unavoidable. There's never going to be a point in history. In the future history, where we have a complete picture of what happened before.
Yes.
There seems to be no possible way that could happen.
Yeah, we're always looking through a glass darkly. But what I like to think about it is that each time collectively, as a species or as a culture or even as a group of people, a group of scholars, a group of people interested in coming closer, although never arriving at the truth of what happened, we peel back some more of the layers and the mystery deepens, but we're able to draw things into the present that previously were discarded or left out of the picture. Mm-hmm. And that even it's almost like we get closer, but we never arrive, but we dig a little deeper. We get a little closer, and it's in that kind of process of refinement and research and reflection, and then teasing those themes back into who we are, that really informs where we're going as a species as well.
Yeah, so there's the idea of sort of advancing a narrative, I think you're trying to get at.
But it's also changing the narrative, right? Because it's also one of the things we were discussing in or talking about that this lecture provided perspective on was the start of river valley civilizations and the start of agricultural civilizations. And for up until this lecture, I had no idea that there is a substantial amount of evidence that river valley civilizations could have started in Europe, in Romania, for example.
Right, so 3,800 BC through to 3,500 BC.
Exactly.
Right, 3,800 BC to...
That's right, yeah, and that is really interesting because I had been brought up with the narrative, and even in the books I had read throughout this year on agriculture and human history, the narrative always places agriculture as arising in the Nile, in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, and then sometimes in China as well. There's no discussion of old Europe as a location.
The sort of traditional perspective on this is exactly, it's in the Chinese, the Syrian and Mesopotamian, the Egyptian, and the Harappan civilization as well in India, and then of course there's a slight touch on the South American civilizations. But no, this old Europe idea was new to me as well.
Yeah, really interesting.
And the part of things that the explanation for why old Europe is a late comer to the party in the second episode of Richard Bulliet's history course, his explanation for this is basically that when you are doing excavation in Mesopotamia and Egypt at that period of time, there's huge conflict in the area of old Europe, which for us in the future, if we've forgotten, and listeners at home if there are any, that is on the western side of the Black Sea.
Exactly.
The northwestern side of the Black Sea. That's old Europe. So at the point where you're excavating in Egypt and Mesopotamia, that part in the northwestern Black Sea is just not a place that you're able to go around and dig and pull stuff out and leave and take it to Europe for analysis.
Exactly.
There's real turmoil there. Whereas for socio-political reasons, it's a lot easier to show up in Egypt and Mesopotamia and
take shit
and take stuff out of the ground and put it in the British Museum.
No, exactly.
And that, I mean, to sort of sidetrack a little bit, like that in a way is one of the sort of fascinating parts of how history
Absolutely.
works, and how of the sort of diverse narratives of colonialism, that there's an incredibly negative. There's a struggle between these incredibly negative pictures of colonialism with the fact that there's huge amounts of intellectual knowledge that come out of the stability that colonialist nations brought to certain regions.
Right.
And I think some people would try and undermine the idea of that stability in general, and there's certainly elements of truth to that. But there are actual ways that you can measure how stable a place is, and those ways certainly aren't going to give you the whole picture. Like, there's always going to be gaps and holes in these sorts of knowledge. But when you're getting real historical knowledge out of a place, there are moral issues with how it was obtained.
Exactly.
But there's scientific validity to the knowledge that was gained.
Right.
And that, it's one of the things that's fun about history is that it's incredibly complicated.
Right.
It's one of the things that's challenging and difficult about history when you try to bring it into the present and deal with sort of personal connections to this matter.
Definitely.
Is all of a sudden you have to confront sort of the moral difficulties of the situation.
And just to kind of end off that story that the professor was telling was that old Europe was researched most effectively by the Russians during the Soviet Union. And so they do all their research, and
that's a moral quagmire.
That's a moral quagmire, especially because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, these Russian scientists and archaeologists are invited to America, as he's detailing, and they give a presentation or a series of presentations on their findings of old Europe. And the problem is their work has not been sufficiently translated into English or other Western languages. And there's not enough...
Yeah, and these lectures are in 2010.
And these lectures are in 2010, exactly.
So by then, there's been more translation, but clearly the ideas have not made their way into the major narratives that we're reading.
No, exactly. And the professor had that interesting, phrase where he says trickle down, that these kind of sort of discussions, it takes a while before the initial discovery or initial acknowledgement of a new narrative or a new tributary in this overall river of history that we find ourselves in, this new direction that we hadn't previously thought it had flowed, before we realize it, before that kind of new tributary trickles into the overall body of water or body of knowledge that we have or take as for granted, which I find is a really interesting process, because I think people now in particular are really trying to question and look for other rivers or other examples of historical narratives that do have validity but have not kind of trickled into our conception.
Yeah. And the question is sort of how... these things are always at this level... So this is reminding me of sort of a parallel stream of thought, which is how higher education integrates new knowledge.
Yeah.
And one of the great difficulties with analysis of how higher education integrates new knowledge is there's basic physical realities to it. And those basic physical realities are funding.
Yeah.
Are professors... professors don't exist in a vacuum, as nice as it would be first to think that way.
And as much as they would like to.
As much as they would like to. They actually have to be funded.
Yeah.
And positions have to exist for them, and universities have to decide to put more money into certain departments.
Right.
And the sad fact of the matter is, the overall shift in universities across the Western world, especially in the United States, is to limit the size of your non-wealth producing departments.
Exactly.
With the idea that wealth producing departments are based on the so-called economical value of a degree. So you're seeing engineers, doctors, and lawyers.
Business schools. Exactly.
Business schools. That's the fourth one. Thank you. Those places are the ones where the real money is.
Yeah.
And if you're doing humanities, if you're doing philosophy, if you're doing history, if you're doing languages, then I'm sorry, we don't have the dime for you, because in some, in the bizarre way that the funding for these institutions works, these groups of thought are no longer seen as important.
Right.
The most radical change here is undoubtedly in the field of classics, which you go back 50, 100, 200 years ago, is the topic in universities. It's
right.
You go to university and you learn classics, and then you might do some other things on the side. So when we're trying to think about, when I think this is a picture that we both understand quite well because of our personal relationship to these topics, but when we're trying to think about incorporating new branches of knowledge, this is the underlying stream.
Yeah.
People are going, well, it would be awfully nice if we had more Aboriginal, more racial narratives inside history. It'd be awfully nice if we had more of these narratives inside classics. It'd be awfully nice if all these new chunks of knowledge were incorporated into the academic curriculum. And to my knowledge, the response to that is an overwhelming, yes, that would be awfully nice, but the money's not there. You can't ask people who are having courses cut across the board to add 3 more courses for intersectional history. how like the basic reality of the situation is kind of
and professors have to kind of do some gymnastics if they want those perspectives included in their class. Like often they'll invite guest speakers or do placements, or have a sort of on the ground component of their courses where they take students to go and work with people up from a community that have a particular localized knowledge that the professor believes is really valuable. So the students can get those perspectives. But often that is not, in my opinion, sufficiently supported or validated by the institution as like something we should be doing.
So it's this very complicated picture.
I think in pockets it's starting to change. U of T now has a master's in the environment that's coming. I think it came this year, or it's going to come September of this year. So, and that involves, of course, because of the sort of political reality, that involves more indigenous-centered curriculums, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really good. Mm-hmm. But that's new. That's really, really new. And we still have to see how that turns out. And that's just at U of T right now.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
No, my overall thing is just, I would really like it if there was more wealth and more pressure put on institutions to create new departments and to explore these new ideas and these new pieces of knowledge. But there's when these places are being criticized, often that sort of aspect of things is ignored.
Yeah.
And that's not. I don't want to point any fingers for whose fault that is. I think the overall fault is the fact that the way institutions are being run across the world right now is driving them to not value these sorts of knowledge.
No, exactly.
And that pointing fingers at the individual professors is easier than trying to
confronting that institutional dynamic. A lot of universities right now, if you go up and find the president of the university, they're not an academic per se. They're a business person.
Yeah, they're a CEO.
They are a CEO, and they run shit like a CEO.
Of course.
That's what they're taught. But I think this is also really interesting because I think it gets at something you mentioned at the beginning of this recording, which is, one of your goals and something that you really value is being able to kind of have a sort of view of these different tributaries of knowledge and being able to move between them and understand how they relate to each other. So that's why you like history in particular, because if you got a problem in math and you want to know more about it, you can link it in history. If you got a problem in science and you want to know more about it, you can link it in something that kind of we all share and understand and are able to talk about it in a really interesting way. But I think a lot of people, especially in academic institutions and in those departments that we talk about that are the money producing ones, they're often siloed. They're often not taught to think about the interrelatedness of things. They're often taught to think about their discipline in a particular way, to focus and specialize on the particular knowledge that is going to get them more money or is going to be successful, or are narrowed down to focus on a very particular view of the subject that they find themselves immersed in.
Right. So this ties into my sort of critique of which is sort of on the back burner for me, because there are huge issues with just the way people are treating universities right now, and the damage that people are trying to do to our institutions of learning. I don't think that what we have set up is perfect by any stretch of the imagination. It's just when people are trying to degrade the only thing that we have that values knowledge above almost anything else, that takes precedence over reforming those institutions and figuring out how to make them better deal with knowledge. When we're in a world where people are actively attacking the idea that we should have people around who hold knowledge and whose job it is to produce knowledge, that takes priority over criticizing those people and trying to get them to do knowledge better. I think there's huge value to having groups of people the way universities are set up. Once we've passed beyond, okay, let's ignore that massive chunk of the situation and just look at the way universities function. The way universities function is based on results that are measured in terms of publication. This is, I've worded that just generally enough that I think it covers all of the branches.
Right.
This is certainly how it works in things like the humanities.
Yeah, you got to publish stuff. You got to get recognition. And that's how you validate yourself internally and externally as a true scholar.
Yeah, exactly. If you're producing works that people are referencing, that's a huge book.
Yeah.
That's something that you can point to, and you can be all like, I'm doing valuable work.
Yeah.
1,000 people reference my paper.
Exactly.
In some fields, that's not a giant amount of people, and in some fields, that's a huge amount of people.
Right.
But that means that, your goal is then to find pieces of information that people want to reference.
Yeah.
So you're forced to be looking for foundational things that are very specific.
Yeah.
Because if you claim your territory in this specific little chunk of academia, then you kind of, it's like you're holding a bridge between one set of ideas to another set of ideas. Everybody has to pass through your bridge.
Yeah, they got to pay the toll.
Everybody's got to cite your paper.
Exactly.
And if everybody cites your paper, you get a huge amount of recognition, validation, and on some basic level, the system makes sense because it means people are reading your work, hopefully.
Yeah. Now, part of the issue with that, and I think the example we talked about, Old Europe, speaks to that, is that what if you find a piece of knowledge that is really valid, say something like Old Europe, but it's not necessarily something that everybody wants to read, or everybody in your field wants to read at that particular time.
That's the issue.
Yeah.
If you find and there's a lot of different ways to find knowledge that fall out of that paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
But if you find knowledge that is over here, very interesting, very important to the way narratives are interpreted,
right,
but not necessary for people to pass through,
right,
then it naturally has a disadvantage against other work that's more intrinsic to the narratives that people are used to.
Mm-hmm.
If you find work that is interdisciplinary,
right,
that's also often a big stumbling block,
right?
Because your interdisciplinary work is drawing on a basic level from multiple different disciplines. So people who are knowledgeable about a particular discipline may not want to touch your work because then they would have to claim some sort of knowledge of the other discipline.
Right.
So you're forcing, like, academics in general don't want to have to take risks because nobody wants to have to take risks in their professional life.
No, exactly. But unfortunately, I believe that the greatest insights into the human condition and what it means to be living in the way we are come when you take risks and come when you do something that people haven't done before, haven't considered before, and you go along a road that is less traveled and it might lead nowhere, and you might have a fruitless search, but you might actually find something that's incredibly valuable and important. And I really believe that is essential to our development.
I think that's certainly true. That if you are, I think a lot of academics feel that
want
way
that
as well.
Yeah, exactly.
That if you have the ability to tie together these different branches of knowledge,
mm-hmm,
and to present ideas that make sense in a bunch of different branches of knowledge, you're doing something really important.
mm-hmm,
And I'm also doing a course on literary theory, and
right,
I think this is part of the reason why literary theory has become such a large part of the humanities at this very early stage in my knowledge of it, because it's presented these ideas that both serve as sort of channels through which people can do a particular sort of analysis, but also serve as binding together these different ideas, or giving you a way of looking at these different things across these different
and moving
fields.
through different things. Like the whole notion in literary theory of intertextuality that I studied quite a bit growing up was this idea that the text does not merely end in the book that you are reading, but extends into the larger culture, into the larger environment from which it arises, and from which it arose, and from which it has influenced. And I find that is particularly helpful because it's, one of the things I think we have to contend with is and this kind of idea, this kind of idea that is talked about in the course we touched on is, where does kind of knowledge arise from? Is it something that we seek out and dig up and find, or is it contained in kind of different vessels? Does it come to us when, say, what's happening right now in our context in Toronto, when there's this movement of people looking at the shared experiences of African and Indigenous people, and that is leading more and more people to kind of delve into the history of that particular branch? That is not coming from like a kind of top-down sort of process. Like a professor didn't decide to go research that and unearth it. That's coming from, to the best of my knowledge, a shared kind of experience that people are having that's bubbling up to the surface and that can no longer be ignored.
Yeah. So what I think I'm taking away from what you said is that maybe it's a little less of a where and more of a how people integrate these different parts of knowledge.
Yeah.
So how, if you have a personal narrative, how do you reconcile that with an academic narrative?
Yeah.
How do you take these different parts of the picture? How do you take these different fields and how do you plug them together? How do you perform that sort of analysis on your own thought?
Right.
Which the things that you think are due to your experience in life, how do you separate them out from being, oh yes, these things are from my experience, these things are inherited knowledge, these things are knowledge from people around me.
Right.
Are there separations between these things? How do these things separate?
Right.
And I think this is why people in the academic world often are very wary of people outside the academic world, because they have people outside the academic world have a tendency to struggle to explain their ideas in academic ways.
Yeah.
And have a difficulty, and a lot of time that's interpreted sometimes wrongly and sometimes rightly by academics as an individual difficulty of telling what is their own experience and what is actual
right. And you can see,
knowledge,
like, from the other side. No, absolutely, yeah. And from the other side, for people who, are from communities that struggle, are from communities where the what has happened historically is so much a part of the identity that they now carry, you could see how it's difficult for them to explain in ways that separate and completely isolate parts of that when it's all kind of interwoven into their personal experience.
Sure. I mean, it's impossible. It's really impossibly difficult to think of yourself as part of a historical narrative.
And I think there needs to be movement from both sides. I think academics need to be more generous in understanding that knowledge expressed in language that is other than academic or not strictly academic needs to be validated. And I also think people, on the other side, that can learn how to express things more logically, a little bit more effectively to the audience that is in the academics.
I think both sides have a lot more to learn.
Yeah.
I think that on the academic side of things, if you're thinking especially about things like historical narrative, it would be good if academics across different fields were more willing to incorporate different or novel or sort of diverse ideas into their ideas and to start to present them in their work, even in relatively small ways.
Right.
I think that's a very difficult evolution to get happening because of the way things are. For people outside the academic world, I think we just don't learn enough. We really, really don't. People don't put as much effort into researching things and learning things as they could.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's not so much of a me coming down and telling people that's how it is sort of thing.
Yeah.
I feel like that's self-admitted.
Yeah.
If you go and you have genuine conversations with people about things they're interested in, almost everybody will tell you straight off the bat that they wish they read more, that they wish they learned more, that they wish they did more research.
No, exactly. But that's why I think kind of there needs to be voices and intermediaries along that bridge. We'll take the metaphor of the bridge. I think that's a good one. There needs to be kind of intermediaries of passage that are able to pull those different people and therefore create the opportunity for conversations to happen. Something I was talking about Ion, and that he said, and why I enjoyed doing a podcast with him way back when we started, was that he says, if you're on it, certain people are going to watch it and certain people are going to listen to it. And then, if I'm on it, a whole set of other people, are going to, that wouldn't watch you necessarily, are going to watch it and are going to be interested in it. And he said vice versa if they just saw me, right? But the whole idea is to get those kind of different people together, having a conversation, and that we can kind of, one of his...
And having a productive conversation.
And having a really productive, like a conversation where we're unafraid to go places and
to exchange ideas.
To exchange ideas and really dig into what each other are saying and trying to come out with a synthesis,
Yeah,
showing, so I think that's really important. And especially because, what we see now is kind of, in the reaction to colonialism, where we live locally in Toronto, there, I think, is the crave to have a different kind of narrative emerge. A narrative that supports and uplifts the people who have been the victims of colonialization. But out of that urge, there needs to be kind of a synthesis of academic perspectives that bring with that the rigor, the tenacity, the resources that what we talked about how we come to actual knowledge, but also the deeply rooted and very valid local knowledge or local interpretation or community interpretation of what that narrative should be. There has to be, a kind of synthesis of those two perspectives. And I don't think they need to be at odds with each other. I really don't. I think they can learn and come together and form a narrative that is both steeped in academic rigor, but also reflective of the moment we have, a moment where we are in time where people want a different kind of narrative than the one that colonialism has given them. If that makes any sense.
No, yeah, I'm feeling you. And I think the big challenge that I think people face in this regard is to repeat myself, it's just learning.
Yeah.
And learning. There are individual issues.
Right.
So there are, so individually, people could do more.
Yes.
But I think the real issue is more that as a society, as a big group of people, that on a large scale, the way we structure our lives and the things that have power over our lives do not encourage us to learn.
Right.
Or do not encourage us to learn enough, or do not encourage us to learn throughout larger periods of our
Right.
lives. I think it depends very heavily on what part of the social structure you are in. And I think there is real historical reason for that.
Definitely.
And that feeds into a historical narrative. And I will tease some of our future conversations by saying that, I have my own ideas about not only how you could move the world maybe towards a place where people are thinking more about that sort of thing and where it is more of a priority in people's lives, but also ideas about how to make it easier for people to communicate on a diverse set of topics while actually being productive. So instead of spending your entire time explaining your point of view, which isn't very helpful, if we sit down and we have a conversation and both of us just narrates what we know, then that seems to me far less productive than sitting down, having a conversation, exchanging the parts of what we know that we need in order to have the discussion that we want to have that explores each other's ideas from each other's perspectives.
Exactly.
So that then, I think historical narrative is a big part in that.
And we should talk about, I think, in a subsequent podcast, just to go off of your teasing, your thesis and what you're trying to do and what you're trying to write and the audience you're trying to reach, right? Because I think there's, I think what's really cool is we can have these kind of conversations in little huddles where we come together, but we're ultimately trying to reach, different kinds of people. And that's really cool, right? Yeah. Like, you're trying to reach a particular kind of group of people, and I'm trying to reach a different kind of group of people. And that's okay, That's good because, certain things that I have to say aren't going to be interesting to certain people, that you're talking to, and vice versa. But that's okay, because when we come together, then it's the idea that, I listened to Gabe. Oh, okay, I want to see who he's talking to. You know what I mean? And so then you kind of get that synthesis, and then I think that helps people sort of take the step or the leap, right? Take the risk. Comes back to risk. Take the risk to listen to something or perspective that they might be holding themselves back from. They might be afraid to learn about,
Communication is incredibly powerful, but it has to be, you have to use it in powerful ways.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't... everybody knows intuitively that you can sit down and you can have a conversation with people for hours. You can enjoy it, and you can get nothing intellectual out of it whatsoever.
No, that's happened a lot.
And those conversations aren't fundamentally bad. But as a world, if we want to improve things and fix the big issues that exist, we need to have more conversations with each other where real information is being passed from head to head.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you do that, then you can start changing the way that our world works.
No, exactly.
Because all of a sudden people will be... because the movement of information follows the movement of power.
No, it's true. It's true. And you ultimately want to be having conversations. You don't want all of your conversations to be like going to the same bar day after day, and that's all you do. You want at least a good portion of your conversations to move you mentally somewhere else, to help you travel somewhere where you haven't been before. Yeah. That's learning.
Totally. All right, buddy. So,
all right, this was a good one. Thank you, man.
Thank you. Boom. So I guess as always, we should send a quick message to our future selves.
Yes.
I really want us both to make it through this whole history of the world
definitely
series. There's so much. I in the future really want to make it through my general study.
Yeah, he's got a good list. We'll talk about it. He's got a good list.
And hopefully make some real progress on this thesis and get to the point where we can chat about it and
definitely
really discuss it, and hopefully can, I can have it in a place where my goal with that thesis is really just to have it, and it is very sort of academically minded, but to have it in a place where I've done what is required to present it to people who are also academically minded, and have them read it and understand the ideas that I think are worthwhile.
Right, exactly.
So what about you, buddy? What's your
I think those are really, really
message to your historical narrative?
Yeah, that's right. Those are really good goals. I think for me is I want to, deepen my knowledge as well. But I want to kind of have conversations, whether they are written form with ideas, me conversing with ideas, or recorded form with me talking to people, that kind of produce the sort of communication and movement and synthesis that we think is so valuable. And I want to have those in a form that other people can read and share and get something from. Nice. And I want those to be inspiring enough for other people to start doing them themselves, or do more of that kind of work themselves. You know, I really want to uplift all of us, as best as we can.
All right, that's a great idea, man.
That's good, man.